Hello, folks. I want to welcome you back to part two of why flooding occurs in the Upper Broad River Watershed. This is the second video that I'm recording as part of this whole explanation of why the flooding that came from Hurricane Helene was so bad in the Hickory Nut Gorge area. Then the last video talked about details of the Upper Broad River Watershed and how those different aspects of the watershed make it prone to flash flooding, whether it's from an event that occurs as part of a hurricane or some other event, such as just a storm, which can bring lots of water at a given time and cause flooding. It doesn't have to necessarily be caused by a hurricane, although what we generally see is that tends to bring some of our highest floods or highest uh, uh, events in our area. So it's important to understand that it doesn't just have to be a hurricane that can cause significant flooding. Several days of rain over a period of time can also cause significant flooding. But nevertheless, we're going to get into something that is a little bit further away from the actual watershed aspects and talk about flooding in general and the importance of the floodplain. So, we want to start with talking about some of the significant flood events that have occurred starting in the 20th century. And the one we most often think about is the great 1916 flood. That's probably the most famous flood event that occurred during the 20th century. And it's so famous because, like Hurricane Helene, it caused large amounts of damage region wide. So, this was a storm that affected pretty much most of Western North Carolina, particularly the Broad River Basin, the Catawba River Basin, and the French Broad Basin. So, very similar to Hurricane Helene in terms of the impacts. Now, it's important to note that during the 1916 flood, there were significantly fewer people in the area, in the mountain regions of North Carolina. So that in itself reduced a lot of impacts that could have potentially occurred. If we were to compare that to today with the number of houses, the amount of impervious surface, things like that that are present throughout the area, those things increase the amount of water that can potentially enter into streams and thus raise water levels. So, 100-year flood, and I'll talk about what that means here in a little bit. 100-year flood now is different than what a 100-year flood would have been back in, say, 1916. The 1916 flood, very significant event. It's a very studied event by historians and scientists. Both have really looked at that event as kind of a benchmark for how catastrophic floods can be in the mountains because of the amount of damage that occurred at that time. I wasn't born until 1973, so I can't speak to any of the storms that came through the Hickory Nut Gorge area or Western North Carolina, for that matter, between 1916 and by the time I was born. And after I was born, I don't recall, just for lack of interest, any significant events. It doesn't mean there weren't any, but I just don't remember. And as I said in part one of the video, the storms that I remember are the ones after I started working in the Hickory Nut Gorge area, particularly Tropical Storm Beryl that came through in '94, and then the Great Flood of '96, which for most people, I think, especially people who lived in the valley, and even some who were still alive at the time that remembered the 1916 flood, they said that that was the worst flood to occur in the area since 1916. So that kind of gives us a bit of a reference as to what that storm was like. And I didn't explain this in part one, but the 96 flood occurred on the front end of the arrival of Hurricane Fran. Hurricane Fran was an Atlantic storm that was moving into, and it ended up making landfall down around Cape Fear of North Carolina near Caswell Beach. And that storm was predicted to bring a lot of wind to our area. Because of where it occurred, we weren't expecting a lot of rain as a result of that storm. But what ended up happening is there was a low pressure system that was moving in from the west, that as it moved in over the Appalachians, the influence of Hurricane Fran as it was coming ashore caused that low pressure system to stall over the mountains and caused this huge amount of rain. I believe the area received it's like 17 inches of rain over the course of 24 hours. And the most substantial rain was 11 inches in 2 hours. And that was, it started raining during the day. And this was basically right after Labor Day weekend. So it could have potentially been a horrendous event had it happened in a different period of the weekend. But it was a very rainy day, and that night was when the heaviest rainfall came. And like I said, 11 inches in 2 hours, and folks woke up the next morning to just mass destruction. Not unlike what we saw with Hurricane Helene. But that's the largest event that I remember over the course of my almost 51 years until Hurricane Helene. So that was 96. In 2004, we had a triple whammy come through. We had Hurricane Francis, which brought a lot of rain, a lot of destruction into Western North Carolina, a lot of landslides, a lot of retaining wall failures, foundation failures, significant flooding in the Hickory Nut Gorge area itself, but nothing like the 96 flood. Following Hurricane Francis, we had Hurricane Ivan and Hurricane Jean. So we had all three of those storms come through, and each one did its own share of damage as it came through the area. And then things were kind of quiet for a few years, didn't have a lot of significant hurricanes that had a big impact on the area. We would get the occasional little flash flood from a thunderstorm or something like that, because that occurs in the Hickory Nut Gorge area because of the type of topography that we have here. But it wasn't until I think 2018 when we saw another storm, and I don't remember the name of it because it wasn't apparently big enough to make me make a mental note of it. But there was significant flooding with that. And then we get to Hurricane Helene. Now, it's important to note that we went through a long period of time without significant hurricanes. And from a land management and planning standpoint, that's always a worrisome thing, because you know that at some point there's going to be a storm that's going to come through that's going to cause a significant amount of damage, and no one is going to be ready. And I think the reason for that is because as humans, we like to always embrace the good things that are happening, and we try to think about the positive and how we love living in a particular area, and the things that we look forward to, and we don't really like thinking about the negative things that could potentially happen. And so, because of that short memory that we tend to have, a lot of these events are just never at the forefront of our mind. And thus, when these disasters happen, all of a sudden we look at things in a totally different way, and it's all of a sudden our eyes are wide open, and we wonder, oh, how could this happen? And it's just mainly because we just really don't think about all of the things that are going on to cause these different problems that occur. So I want to make sure that everyone understands that the significance of these storms. And really, you can expect one of these a significant flooding event, um, not necessarily on the scale of a 1916 flood or Hurricane Helene, but you can expect a what I would call a severe flooding event pretty much every decade. They're almost generational storms. And we can look at the weather data from the past century, and you can see that there are significant storms that occur about once a decade. And these are storms that we can pretty well remember as being significant because of the amount of damage that occurred and things that happened in terms of landslides, roads washing out, and those kinds of things. So it's important to understand the frequency that significant storm events can occur. But now what I want to focus on is I want to look at the area from more of a magnified point of view because we want to look at the floodplain itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip over here and I'm going to share my screen here so that you can kind of see what I'm looking at. This is called the FRIZ, which basically is the flood risk information system. Now, this is an important piece of mapping, if you will, provided by the North Carolina floodplain mapping folks in Raleigh. And this is a tool that anyone can access. You can look this up online and you can peruse this. The maps are divided up, and I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. You can see that there's a grid here, and each grid number corresponds to a particular portion of a map. And the one that actually, there's multiple ones we're mostly concerned with are these up in here all the way over. And we'll even look at some of these down this way because all this was impacted through the flooding that occurred from Hurricane Helene. So let's go back up here. We're going to go into Bat Cave portion here, and you can see there's all these little things that are moving in and out, and we're going to look at those different parts individually. So let's start right here with the confluence of our three main streams that I mentioned in the first video. So here we have Hickory Creek right here. We have the Broad River coming down through here. And then over here we have Reedy Patch Creek. You can just follow my cursor and that will take us through all this. Now, it's important to understand, and I mentioned this in the video, that the Broad River, at least the part that runs through the main part of Hickory Nut Gorge, is currently referred to as the Rocky Broad River. That's not its official name. This is a name that has been given to it basically by the local people who live in the Bat Cave, Chimney Rock area. It's had that name for supposedly since the 1916 flood. And the reason that it got that name was apparently, this is according to local legend and mythology and so forth, prior to the 1916 flood, that river was not rocky, didn't have big boulders in it and things like that until the 1916 flood. And what was explained to me was that as a result of that flood, there were significant landslides that occurred throughout Hickory Nut Gorge. And with those slides, large boulders rolled down the sides of the mountains, along with the water and the soil and everything else that was up on the slopes. At that time, there was a lot of logging that had occurred in the valley, and so a lot of the soils were disturbed. There was trees that were no longer in place that would have helped absorb a lot of the velocity of rain, the energy as it came down. And so with trees being removed, significant areas of the gorge and the valley being denuded as far as the trees were concerned, this increased the potential for runoff. And the more runoff there is, the greater the amount of flooding there is. So all these rocks rolling into the Broad River changed the character of the river, changed the geomorphology of the river, changed the hydrology, and really created the conditions that we now see in the river, or well, I should say, saw before Hurricane Helene, what everybody would remember as far as what the river looked like. The river looks much different now after Hurricane Helene. There's been significant change to the stream morphology, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. And I don't want to stay on that topic for too long because we do have a lot that I want to try to get to. But we will try to talk some about the changes that have occurred with the stream. And I wish I had pictures to be able to show you some of that. But let's get back to this so that you can kind of understand what some of these things mean. So this area that is in blue here, this represents what we call the 100-year floodplain. And when we say 100-year flood, it's important that we make a distinction here. That does not mean that this type of flood occurs every 100 years. What it means is that every year there is a 1% chance that an event of this size could occur. Now, a 100-year flood can occur in multiple times in a single year. So that's why we call it a 1% chance flood. They don't occur regularly, but there is a chance, a 1% chance that you could have that type of flood event any given year. Okay. And then we also have the 500-year flood, which is shown in yellow further down here. We'll talk about some of these things that are found down here. The 500-year flood is a 0.2% chance that an event of that size could occur in the area. So we're looking at a 1% chance flood and a 0.2% chance flood. Now, I've heard it said, and I don't know. All I can go is just what I have heard. I've heard people say that this flood with Hurricane Helene was perhaps greater than a 1,000-year flood. And I don't know. I haven't seen the data. I haven't seen any engineering reports that are related to that. Perhaps in parts of Western North Carolina, that may be true. In Asheville or Swannanoa or Black Mountain, that may be the case, or even over near Brevard in Transylvania County. I don't know. But from what I can see, looking at flood data, the inundation map that's shown here, and that's the stuff in blue, it's very, very close to what was seen during Hurricane Helene. So we actually may be truly looking at a 100-year or a 500-year event, depending on what things that we look at and all that. So I'll talk about some of those things here as we go along. And if you look on the stream here where the blue is, you'll see numbers that run across the stream and these little black marks here. And these black marks are basically cross sections where when they were developing the flood model, they surveyed points of elevation to mark what the base flood elevation would be of this 100-year flood. Okay, so for instance, this area right here would be 1,481.1 feet, would be the essentially the top of your flood waters. Okay, now this is not it would probably be a little bit higher in the center of the stream or where you have your current, but this is the average of the flood elevation spread out across that part of the floodplain. Okay, so that's important to know. And if you look up here on this thing right here, where I'm moving up and down, there is more information that you can get through looking at this right here. You can find your flood information. All you have to do is click on a spot, and it will tell you information about that particular area. Like for instance, there's a house right here. We click on that. It tells us that it is in an AE zone. Okay. It's a Reedy Patch Creek. The base flood elevation is 1,464.3 feet. It's in Henderson County, and a few different things like that. The effective date of this flood panel was in 2010. Okay, so that's when this area was last mapped. Okay, and that's important because these things change periodically as areas go through mapping. Different things can change, and so and this is the most recent map for this particular part of North Carolina. And so that's the only data that we have to go by. So we can come back, and this would be considered an impacted structure because it sits in the middle of this flood zone. Now, I don't know any more information about it because it doesn't really tell me any more information about that particular house. Okay. There's other information here. There's the flood risk information. Here it tells us a little bit about information about the property. It tells us what the fair market value is of that structure, how many stories, the number of square feet, has a basement, so on and so forth. Okay, and it tells us about the flood risk for this particular house. We can also come up here that we can get what's called the FIS report, and this tells us about floodway data, non-encroachment zones, some different information that is good for engineers and things like that. And there's engineering models. These are helpful for engineers that are studying the floodplain to try to do letters of map revision and things like that. And you can also export data, export maps, and things like that. So this is a tool that is generally used by floodplain managers, engineers, surveyors, and even insurance companies when they're trying to determine whether or not a house is in a flood zone and whether or not they can be granted flood insurance. If you have a house in a flood zone, flood insurance can be very, very important because if you don't have flood insurance and your house gets taken out by a flood, then you have no way, you have no recourse as far as being able to replace a lot of the things that you would have in your house. So flood insurance can be very important. And in some cases, if you don't have flood insurance, you can't even get a mortgage from a lending company to build a house. So flood insurance can be extremely important. So all these little elevations here are the flood elevations as the river travels downstream. And you can notice that those elevations get lower and lower as you go. Now we get to this little point right here, 1,411.3 feet. And we start to see some new things occurring here in this portion of the Broad River. And what's going on here is this is an area where a detailed study was performed of the river. These little hatch marks here, these blue and gray hatch marks, this is what we call the floodway. Anything outside of the floodway is what we call the flood fringe. And these are non-encroachment zones. The blue, again, is still representing the 100-year flood. uh, area, and then the yellow is representing the 500-year or 0.2% flood zone. Now, if we look very closely at this, we can see approximately where stretches of the river got out of their banks and in basically wrecked road. Uh, I don't know what the complete number is, but I would guess that after Hurricane Helene, about 70% of the road surface has been wiped out. It may not be that much. Like I said, I haven't been up through there, so I don't know. But just based on pictures that I've seen, it's a significant amount of highway that is now missing. And it doesn't necessarily mean that in all those cases that water flowed over the road and removed it. But what it does mean is that because the river runs so close to the road, that perhaps the river eroded the soil that's up underneath the road and caused the road to collapse. So in many cases, we have collapsed road because of the proximity of where the river was running to the road. In many cases, it did come out into the road. And you can actually see on the map here places where that would be predicted by our flood model here. So there's a lot of indications that show that this flood could have very well been as much as a 500-year flood based on where the yellow zones are. It could have been greater than that, but there's until we see what the rainfall data was, it would be really impossible to be able to fully tell that. But when we look at the damage that occurred, it's pretty consistent with what this map shows in terms of structural damage. I mean, here is the Dogwood uh, campground, and these structures here are all the structures that would have been predicted to have been taken out by a 100 or 500-year flood. And I would say that's probably pretty accurate, just based on pictures that we've seen. Now, it's also important to think about what is going on with the stream. So, as a stream flows through straight areas, streams don't like to be straight. But obviously, there's going to be areas of stream where they are straight. And the reason I say streams don't like to be straight is because what happens is this is where you have significant amounts of erosion that occur because the faster the water is moving, the greater impact that it has and the more cutting capacity it has to be able to remove material. And this is what tends to cause banks to scour out and things like that. So some of these straighter areas of river is where you tend to get a lot of damage to your roads because that river is scouring out the banks and things like that. And then as that river's moving fast, when it reaches a bend, okay, because that water is moving so fast, a lot of times the bend itself acts as a dam and forces water up over the edge. And so that's kind of what we saw while we saw flooding down the road. This was spillover water that was coming up over the bank and running down the highway. You also have landslides that were occurring up on the slopes up here, bringing material down, causing obstructions that water had to move around. And so there's a lot of dynamics that are taking place in the stream to cause a lot of the flooding, things like that. There's a really hard turn that the river has to make right here. So this would have probably likely been an area where there was significant damage to the road. The river actually is pretty low here in terms of where compared to the road. There's some distance between the highway and the river under normal flow. But if the river is at high flow, there's high potential for scouring of the bank, and thus you could get collapse of the road as a result of that. We keep on moving down. So here's our Dogwood campground. Come on down here into the main part of Chimney Rock. Here would be what used to be called Judy's Motel. Here's our little Bayou Billy's little fun park there. I don't know what the name of it is, but that's what I always call it. Here is the bistro. Notice how far the river is for even the 500-year flood zone is from the front of the bistro there. And again, you're talking about a choke point that occurs right here because you have a wide floodway down through here that the river's moving very quickly. I mean, it's dropping from 1,102 feet to 1,080 feet. So that's a big drop in elevation from here to here. And then it drops another almost 10 feet from here to here. So that's a lot of velocity coming down through here. And then you get this choke point right here. So where choke points occur, this causes backup of water. And so this causes some spillover that likely came down here into the road. This would have been what was running down the street as water was trying to get around these structures. These structures actually created an impedance for the water. And so that basically split the water and caused it to have to go down the street instead of all staying within the river channel. Also, it's likely, and again, I haven't seen it. I would love to. There's probably some landsliding that occurred up in here in some of these places, and all that also joined with the flow that was coming down through here. Now, I haven't mentioned bridges, but bridges also serve as choke points for floodwaters. And most of the time, river or when floods occur, if it's a 100-year event or higher, those bridges are going to be taken out. And I want you to look right here at the Chimney Rock Park Bridge, which is right here. Based on the pictures that I saw, right here where the floodway is, this is the part of the bridge that got taken out. There's just a little bit of bridge left, and voila, the floodway comes right through here, and it took out this part of the bridge. Okay, that seems to very closely mirror what the impacts are of a 100-year flood. Okay, and again, I'm not saying this was a 100-year flood. It may have been greater than a 100-year flood. I don't know. Haven't seen the hydrologic data to know that for sure. But things look awful similar to what the map is showing in terms of impacts of a 100-year flood. We look at these structures here that were impacted. This is the little Billy where the gemstone mining and things like that occurs. Here, the rock shop. This is Bubba O'Leary's right here, and we can see these impacts that have occurred to these buildings. And I remember in the '96 flood, some of these buildings were impacted, and some were even condemned and had to be rebuilt. And so it's unfortunate, really, that this has occurred because so many of these businesses are places that we love and that we shop at, and these are people, friends that we know and have come to love and cherish because of their contribution to the community and just the ways that we've got to know a lot of these people. And so, your heart breaks for a lot of these folks because you know that their lives and their livelihoods have been so heavily impacted by this storm. And it just shows really how nature really doesn't care about us in terms of what we do and things like that. I mean, this little town, Chimney Rock Village, these are all the structures that are found here in the village. We don't know what the future holds for this town and what regulations will allow to occur in this part of the floodplain. That's kind of an unknown at this point. I know through just sheer determination that the people of Chimney Rock are looking forward to rebuilding as much as they can and looking towards the future of what this may all look like. It may look different than what it looked prior to Hurricane Helene. We just don't know. But this shows us where the potential damage would have been and where it and by looking at the pictures we know what areas were impacted, and the map actually pretty closely reflects that. If we come down here, this is over on Southside Drive. I don't know how many structures over here were impacted. I know a lot of this front row, this riverfront row, is probably very close to what areas were impacted there. Like I said, I don't know for sure. Moving further on down, you can see the drop in elevation. And then we get right here. Now, this is where the detailed study ends because now we're getting into the waters of Lake Lure. Actually, this is still the river right through here, but it is where the river slows down significantly as it enters Lake Lure. And so we got 1,001.5 feet elevation right here. This is showing this flowing over the bridge that ties Lake Lure to Chimney Rock. Now, when we look at this, it shows here's the flowering bridge. This is the old bridge that took people from Lake Lure into Chimney Rock before this bridge was built. Now, one of the things that happened, if you look at this bridge and you look at the differences between the two, the end of this bridge is right here. And a lot of people saw this and said, oh my gosh, the flowering bridge got taken out. And no, the flowering bridge didn't get taken out. What happened is water blew the land out right here on this end of the bridge, basically took it out, left a big old pathway through here because it had to go somewhere. And so it basically left the end of the bridge exposed. In fact, you can look at pictures, you can actually see the wing walls of the bridge that are still there. So the bridge itself is still there, but there's just a big open hole where the river plowed a new pathway through there. And that happened in part because of the amount of debris that built up along behind this bridge here. This most likely the old bridge and this bridge here together created enough of an obstruction to catch trees and debris that was being washed down from upstream, from way up in the watershed all the way down through Bat Cave and Chimney Rock Village. It all got captured here, and the force of and because of the back pressure that was building up, the water was forced out and forced to come around, flowing through the gardens of the flowering bridge and working its way through here and eroding that material away. So as we move further on down into Lake Lure territory, here we have Town Hall. Notice the Town Hall is completely surrounded by floodwaters in this model. And I would say that this is a very likely scenario of the areas that were inundated during Hurricane Helene. Again, I don't know for sure because it wasn't there, but based on the pictures that I've seen, this is very accurate. This is the only area that was not flooded by Hurricane Helene because this is a high area. It's higher than 998.1 feet, which is the base flood elevation for Lake Lure. But notice everything else would have been inundated, underwater, and so forth. And we do know that water came across this area right here. Because this area was wet, this is actually the floodwaters that actually destroyed the marina over here. So a lot of huge impacts here. Now, I want to mention something right here because I think it is significant. This 998.1 feet here, this when these maps were being developed, this was a subject of debate. And I remember the town at the time we tried to appeal this number because if we go on down to the dam, and let's just move on down there. We'll go. Let me zoom out. We can get there faster. If we go down to Lake Lure Dam right here. So the top of the Lake Lure Dam, the point where water flows over the dam, is right here. And the the elevation at the lowest tubes is 995 feet. Okay. Lake Lure is held at full pond at 990 feet mean elevation. So at 995 feet, water flows over the dam. And we saw that during this storm. Okay. And that was with the 3 floodgates fully open and water still flowing over the dam. Now, you think about this number right here. This is 3 feet of freeboard, if you will, 3 feet extra of water flowing over the dam. And I would say this is probably accurate. Shocking that this happened the way it did, but the predictions, the modeling that occurred looks to be 100% accurate as far as what occurred with this flood. Now, one of the things it doesn't show, and who knows, it actually may have been higher than that, because what we saw was we see water that came through, punched a hole through the road right here and poured over this wing wall of the dam and rolled down into here. We also have water that scoured out down in here, took out the pump station down here that's part of the sewer system of the town of Lake Lure. So this may very well, based on what we're seeing here, appears to be quite accurate. And then if we go on downstream and look at things that occur downstream, it's the same kind of story. These areas that were inundated by the river as water was being let out through the gates and flowing over the dam, the areas that flooded downstream, it's very, very similar. We can see the road underwater through these little stretches, and that is 100% accurate as far as what we saw here. Now, the river didn't quite make it over the road, but it definitely got into the back parking lot of Lake Lure Baptist Church, and that seems to be very accurate in terms of what happened with the flooding of Helene. And even downstream, we go down to the areas that were impacted along Highway 6474, down in the river valley itself. Here's Lake Lure Marine and the areas that would have been impacted there. There's a house right here that's this was built after the flood maps were made. So they are actually elevated up out of the flood zone. They had to go in and put in, build their house according to floodplain regulations of the county. And so this place, their house here is actually elevated, so it was not impacted by the flooding that was going on all around them. Okay, we can go out here and we can look at some of these other areas that were impacted. This whole area right here was completely underwater during the flood. So we know that based on what we're seeing with the flood studies that were done and the mapping, this is pretty doggone close to a 100 to 500 year flood event based on just looking at the maps. So there's a lot of things that we can learn from looking at these maps. When we look at the watershed, we look at the proximity of building to a river that we know can flood. That should tell us that there's things that we really need to think about in terms of the future. You know, what kind of decisions that we make in terms of, you know, where we build houses. I mean, granted, there's not a lot of places as far as empty places, empty lots, empty land where you can build. So that means that if we're going to build in the floodplain, there's a certain amount of risk that we have to assume is going to be present. That means that buildings and structures need to be elevated. We certainly don't want anything in the floodway. So a lot of these buildings here, they actually are encroaching into the floodway. So that means that they are very problematic in terms of what types of flood conditions can arise as part of being in that floodway. So there's a lot to learn by studying these maps and a lot to think about in terms of what we do in the future to mitigate flood risk. And this is where it really becomes a responsibility of your town leaders, your council members, and officials to come up with good regulations that work for everyone, that don't prohibit construction, but ensure that construction that takes place is going to be sustainable and is not going to create hazards that will affect people both upstream and downstream. So a lot of things to think about. I remember when I worked for the town, we always used to say, one of these days, the big one's coming. We didn't know when or where, but we knew that at some point, a big storm like the 1916 flood was going to impact this area. And you never do know when. A storm like this could happen more than once in a single year. So it's always something that should be in the back of our minds in terms of what can happen in this area, given the fact that we are in the mountains, we have steep terrain, we have narrow floodplains, and there's just not a lot of places that water can go if the ground is so saturated that it can't absorb water anymore. So a lot to think about. So I want to stop sharing here. So I just want to say that as part of this, I hope you've been able to get some benefit from my explanations of some of these things. There's probably some things that I've forgotten, and I'll think about it later after I go back through everything. And I'm going, oh yeah, I should have said that. I forgot to say this or that. But hopefully I've given you enough information where you now have a better understanding of why floods occur, the dangers of building in a floodplain, and what some of this stuff means for going forward. Because one of the things that we always want to make sure that we do is that we're looking out for human life. That's the most important asset that we have. And in the Chimney Rock Lake Lure area, it's an area that's so dependent on tourism. Not only do we have to look out for the safety of our full-time residents, but we also have to look out for the safety of the people that are coming to enjoy our area. They're staying at our vacation rentals and bed and breakfasts and hotels and motels and all those kinds of things. We have to look out for their safety as much as the people that live here, all the time. And so making smart choices, making smart decisions is going to be very important moving forward into the future. And I said I would mention something about this. When you look at the river after Helene, the river has changed significantly. The pathway of the river is now different. There are parts of the river now that are shallower than they were prior. A lot of the boulders and things that were there as a result of the 1916 flood, they're nowhere to be found now. They've either rolled further downstream and now covered under several feet of sediment in sandbars and gravel bars and things like that, or they've managed to work their way down into Lake Lure where they've been covered up with sediment. We just don't know. Some have just been moved around and reoriented. There's just so much change that has occurred with the river as a result of Hurricane Helene and what it has done. In some places, it actually has taken um, the bedload material and taken it back down to pre 1916 flood. So it's really quite remarkable as far as what we've seen as far as the changes to the river, and it will be something that probably geologists and river morphologists would be really fascinated by, to see the impacts that this storm had on the river itself. I know I'm certainly interested in it, and I can't wait to really get up and take some photos and really see all the changes that have occurred along the river. I'm quite interested in looking at that because I think it will help give us an idea of what's going to happen or what can happen in the future. And it's going to make things really interesting as far as how they go back in and put the road in. Is the road going to be in the same place? What will they do to ensure that the river doesn't take the road out again? What kind of measures will need to be put into the river to redirect its flow so that it's flowing back towards its original pathway rather than along the road? So there's a lot of things that will have to happen, and a lot that will have to be considered moving forward as roads get developed and all those kind of things. So I thank you for listening to my rambling video. I hope that it makes sense, and I hope that through this it can be used as a learning tool for folks. Um, Basically, trying to break things that, while they may seem technical, can actually be put into basic layman's terms. And I hope that I have done that successfully in this video. But again, I want to give a shout out to all the people in Lake Lure and Chimney Rock, so many that are my friends and people that I've known for a long time. My thoughts and prayers are with you guys. Be strong. We're so thankful to all the people who have given of their time and money and goods to support our communities, not just in Lake Lure and Chimney Rock, but throughout Western North Carolina. So many people have been involved, churches, civic groups, just individual volunteers that have been so busy and so helpful trying to restore um, lives from this event. So we really appreciate it so much. We're so appreciative of the linemen that have helped that are still working to restore power and bring back some sense of normalcy until the area has a chance to recover and rebuild. So hopefully, viewers, as you watch this video, you'll join me in keeping all these people in your thoughts and prayers, and just provide encouragement where you can. When you and don't forget about us. Don't forget about the people that have been impacted by Hurricane Helene. When you know, keep when things are back open and are able to be visited again. I know the people in Lake Lure and Chimney Rock, as well as in Black Mountain, Swannanoa, Burnsville, Asheville, all those areas that have been impacted. They want your business. They want you to come back to the area so that you can enjoy our area. Their livelihood depends on you as visitors to our area. So don't forget about us. Um, don't forget about the people that are impacted. And here in Western North Carolina, we will continue to persist as Southern Appalachian people know how to do. And again, we appreciate you. I thank you for watching my video, and hope you enjoy it. Take care.